I want you to picture the baggage carousel at an international arrivals terminal. Just picture it in your head.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Right. You're standing there, you're exhausted, and you're just waiting for a specific piece of luggage. Maybe it's a hard shell case or, a scuffed up canvas duffel bag.
And you're just staring at the conveyor belt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you probably view that bag as just a simple container. It holds your clothes, maybe some souvenirs.
Nothing more to it.
But if you look at that exact same piece of luggage through the lens of international biosecurity, it ceases to be just a bag.
It really does. It becomes a highly volatile, statistically significant vector.
A vector. Because what if clinging to the tread of your hiking boot inside that bag, or maybe dormant inside the wooden grain of a carving you picked up at an artisan market, there's a microscopic biological agent?
And we aren't just talking about, a nuisance bug here.
No, we're talking about a pathogen or an insect with the exact genetic and phenotypic profile required to fundamentally crash your nation's agricultural economy.
Or completely unravel the trophic web of a native forest ecosystem.
It's terrifying when you really think about it.
It is. It forces a complete paradigm shift in how you view global movement, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because for the regulatory bodies and the ecologists tasked with shielding our food supply and biodiversity, that scenario isn't just a hypothetical thought experiment.
Right. They aren't just sitting around making up scary stories.
Exactly. It is a persistent, mathematically quantified threat matrix that they have to navigate every single day.
Every single day.
And the reality is, whether you're bringing home a souvenir or purchasing imported out-of-season produce at the grocery store, or even just integrating an exotic ornamental plant into your landscaping,
You were part of it.
you are an active node. You are within the exact biological pathways governed by the framework we're dissecting today.
Which is just wild to think about.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the invisible regulatory apparatus working behind the scenes. I mean, we are looking at a system designed to mediate the ultimate modern tension.
The tension between basically commerce and nature.
Precisely. The insatiable economic demand for frictionless international trade versus the absolute biological imperative of environmental survival.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today our deep dive is centered entirely on the mechanics of pest risk analysis.
Universally known as PRA.
PRA, right. And we've compiled a really dense stack of source material for this one. It's a highly detailed, heavily cited overview of the PRA framework, complete with all its underlying scientific protocols, the regulatory bibliography, legal precedents, all of it.
It's a lot to get through.
It is, but our mission today is to decode this invisible rulebook of global biosecurity. We're going to examine the exact methodologies nations use to quantify biological danger.
And how they weaponize that data in international trade courts.
Yes, weaponize it. And crucially, we're going to look at the structural blind spots where this globally adopted system might actually be setting us up for catastrophic ecological failure.
And it's vital to establish upfront that this system operates at an intense level of complexity.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we are looking at an international, legal, and scientific apparatus that is fundamentally attempting to predict the unpredictable.
Which sounds impossible.
The economic and ecological stakes are astronomical. And the friction between sovereign trade interests and localized biosecurity, it creates a geopolitical landscape that is just incredibly difficult to navigate.
So let's bypass the basic definitions and get straight into the scope of what we're actually dealing with here.
Good idea.
In a phytosanitary context, and by that I mean the context of international plant health, a pest is far more insidious than what a layperson might think.
Right, it's not just mice in the pantry.
Exactly. The International Plant Protection Convention, or the IPPC, they cast a remarkably wide taxonomic net.
Very wide.
A plant pest is defined as any species, strain, or biotype of plant, animal, or pathogenic agent injurious to plants or plant products.
So it's a massive category.
It's massive. We are talking about highly specialized plant pathogenic bacteria, fungal pathogens, virulent viruses, mites, nematodes, and this is the part that surprised me, invasive weeds.
The inclusion of weeds is particularly interesting.
Right, because you think of a weed as just an annoyance in your garden.
But on a global scale, they act as vicious resource competitors, and they are frequent reservoirs for other pathogenic vectors.
So a weed isn't just taking up water, it's harboring the real killers.
Exactly. And the breadth of that definition is an absolute necessity given the cascading consequences of a breach.
Because when things go wrong, they go really wrong.
When an introduced plant pest establishes itself in a naive ecosystem, an ecosystem that has never seen it before, the outcomes are rarely linear.
Our source material points directly to some foundational research on this, right, by David Pimentel.
Yes, Pimentel's work is crucial here. He looked at the environmental and economic costs of non-indigenous species, specifically in the United States.
And the numbers are staggering.
Pimentel's data illustrates a financial hemorrhage. We are looking at economic damages that run into the billions annually.
Billions.
With a B. Billions. And these are costs derived from obliterated agricultural yields, perpetual chemical eradication campaigns, and the irreversible degradation of native habitats.
Because when a novel pathogen enters an environment lacking co-evolved natural defenses, it doesn't just, damage a specific crop.
No, it destabilizes the entire regional economy that relies on that agricultural output.
Which sets the stage for this massive global tug of war.
The ultimate conflict of interest.
Right, because we have the realities of a hyper-globalized economy. The velocity of international shipping is the lifeblood of modern commerce. Commodities have to flow.
Ships have to move.
But running parallel to that economic mandate is the biological reality you just outlined.
The bugs are moving on those ships.
And the governance of this conflict relies on a delicate balance between two major international entities. On the biosecurity side, we have the IPPC, which is the multilateral treaty functioning as the global cooperative for plant protection.
And their mandate is unambiguous. Prevent the international spread of plant pests and secure appropriate measures for their control.
Stop the bugs. But then, operating on the exact other end of the spectrum is the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Right.
And the WTO's foundational imperative is the liberalization of global markets. They want the aggressive reduction of trade barriers.
They want the ships to keep moving.
So to prevent biosecurity from completely derailing global commerce, the WTO enforces something called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, commonly referred to as the SPS Agreement.
The SPS Agreement acts as a strict regulatory check.
It's basically the referee.
Exactly. It dictates that while sovereign nations absolutely possess the right to enact measures protecting their agricultural and ecological health, they are expressly forbidden from utilizing phytosanitary regulations as a disguised form of economic protectionism.
And that distinction is the crux of the entire global trade system.
Because the temptation to cheat is just immense.
It really is. Think about it. If domestic farmers in country A are being outpriced by a flood of highly competitive imported produce from country B, the easiest political maneuver isn't to, subsidize the domestic farmers.
That costs money.
Right. It's much easier to just artificially block the imports. A government could simply claim, with zero actual evidence, that the imported produce harbors a dangerous nematode, and boom, they shut down the trade route.
Shielding their domestic market in the process.
That is textbook protectionism masquerading as ecological defense.
And to eliminate that exact loophole, the international community relies on the doctrine of technical justification.
Technical justification.
The IPPC mandates that any contracting party seeking to implement a phytosanitary trade barrier, they have to provide an exhaustive, scientifically rigorous technical justification.
You can't just say, we have a bad feeling about these apples.
You cannot act on suspicion, or political pressure, or anecdotal fear. You must present empirically sound, reproducible evidence that the biological threat is tangible, mathematically probable, and severe.
And pest risk analysis, PRA, is the internationally standardized format for that exact burden of proof.
It is the required scientific language nations must use when defending a trade barrier in the international arena.
But, and this is key, this isn't conducted by some centralized global mega laboratory.
No, not at all.
The jurisdiction and the actual execution of a PRA fall entirely on the individual sovereign nations. The framework requires governments to establish national plant protection organizations.
NPPOs.
NPPOs. These are the scientific enforcement arms conducting the actual modeling and analysis.
And to ensure some baseline global consistency, these NPPOs utilize international standards for phytosanitary measures.
Known as ISPMs. This acronym soup is a lot, I know, but it's important. The source highlights a critical triad here.
Right, ISPM 2, 11, and 21.
Let's break those down. ISPM 2 establishes the overarching framework for the analysis.
The big picture.
That ISPM 11 provides the specific protocols for analyzing quarantine pests and environmental risks.
And finally, ISPM 21 governs regulated non-quarantine pests.
However, it is critical to understand that these ISPMs are not rigid prescriptive algorithms, right?
No, they do not dictate the specific mathematical models or the precise climatic mapping software a country must use. They just provide the foundational principles and the necessary criteria that must be evaluated.
It's a blueprint, not a step-by-step instruction manual.
Exactly. And because of this inherent flexibility, nations with significant agricultural resources, the text specifically notes Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, they have engineered their own highly customized, exceptionally rigorous internal PRA methodologies.
They take the basic ISPM framework and just supercharge it with their own domestic epidemiological models and ecological risk matrices.
Because they have so much at stake economically and biologically.
Okay, so that structural framework sets the rules of engagement. Now, I want to dissect the actual operational mechanics of the analysis. Let's look at the anatomy of ISPM 11, which organizes a formal pest risk analysis into 3 distinct sequential stages.
Stage 1 is initiation.
Right, initiation. What is the precise catalyst that forces an NPPO to mobilize its resources, halt a trade negotiation, and launch a comprehensive risk assessment?
The initiation phase is generally activated by one of 3 primary categories of information.
Okay.
The first is pest-based information. This is an activation triggered by data regarding a specific biological organism.
So, like, they actually find a bug.
Exactly. The most obvious scenario is an interception at a border. Inspectors physically detect an anomaly during the routine screening of an imported commodity.
Hey, look what I found in this crate of bananas.
Right. But equally critical is epidemiological surveillance. If an NPPO receives intelligence that a known high-risk pathogen has suddenly expanded its geographic range, or if a severe outbreak is reported in a contiguous neighboring country,
Like it's moving closer to the border.
yes, that epidemiological shift acts as an immediate trigger.
What's fascinating to me is that the trigger doesn't even require physical proximity to a nation's borders.
No, it doesn't.
Our sources show that a PRA can be initiated purely based on emerging scientific literature.
Just reading a journal article.
Literally. An NPPO toxicologist or plant pathologist might be reading a newly published peer-reviewed journal article detailing a novel pathogen, and that academic discovery alone is sufficient to launch a full risk assessment.
The bibliography actually provides a brilliant illustrative example of this.
Oh, the potato one. Right?
Yes, the sudden emergence of the bacterium Dickia solani.
Dickia solani.
It's a highly aggressive pathogen causing blackleg and soft rot in potatoes.
Sounds gross.
It is, and it's devastating to crops. The mere identification and characterization of Dickia solani in the scientific community forced international NPPOs to initiate PRAs to defend their domestic seed potato industries.
They read about it and immediately put up the shields.
Exactly. Another prime example cited is the Asian longhorn beetle, Anaplophora glabripennis.
It's a mouthful.
As data emerged regarding its devastating potential to decimate hardwood forests in the European community, the sheer existence of that data triggered the analytical machinery.
So the scientific literature effectively functions as an early warning radar system.
That's a great way to put it.
But the second category of initiation is arguably more complex, and that is pathway-based information.
Right.
In this scenario, the analysis isn't sparked by a known pathogen, but by a proposed mechanism of movement.
The route itself.
When a nation negotiates the opening of a completely novel trade route, say, importing specific cultivars of live ornamental plants from a region they have never traded with before, the pathway itself is the unknown variable.
The NPPO must initiate a PRA to retroactively model every single biological agent that could theoretically exploit that new logistical pipeline.
And when we talk about pathways, we really have to look beyond standard commercial maritime freight.
It's not just the big shipping containers.
No, the source material emphasizes that articles used in transport, packaging, and personal distribution are intensely scrutinized vectors. This circles directly back to our imagery of the airport luggage.
Airline passenger baggage is highlighted in the research as a premier pathway for the introduction of alien insect species.
A premier pathway, just regular tourists. We are talking about soil residues on footwear, undeclared organic material, and latent hitchhikers inside personal effects.
The data assessing airline baggage as an invasion pathway into the United States is staggering. It demonstrates that the cumulative ecological risk posed by millions of individual travelers rivals and sometimes exceeds the risk profiles of heavily regulated commercial agricultural shipments.
That is just wow. And when you compound that with the international trade in ornamental plants, which the text notes has historically been one of the most successful mechanisms for biological invasions over the past century, you realize that our global logistical infrastructure is just inherently porous.
It's incredibly leaky, and that immense porosity is exactly why the third trigger, policy-based information, is so vital.
Right. Policy.
Often, a PRA isn't initiated by a new bug or a new shipping route, but by a friction point in international law or a dispute over existing phytosanitary measures.
The lawyers get involved.
If a trading partner fundamentally challenges the scientific validity of a barrier you've erected, it can force a retroactive analysis.
Which brings us to the high-stakes reality of WTO disputes. The source specifically mentions international trade disputes over apples as a prime catalyst here.
The apple disputes are famous in this field.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. If country A places a hard ban on the importation of apples from country B, citing the risk of a specific bacterial blight, country B isn't just going to roll over and accept the economic loss.
Of course not.
They will escalate the issue to the World Trade Organization, arguing that the blight risk is statistically negligible and the ban is just illegal protectionism.
You just want to protect your own apple farmers.
Exactly. To defend their sovereignty and keep the ban in place, country A is now legally obligated to initiate a massively detailed, highly quantified PRA specifically tailored to prove their technical justification to an international tribunal.
The PRA becomes a defensive weapon in trade litigation.
So, by the conclusion of initiation, the NPPO has locked in the precise identity of the pest or the pathway under scrutiny, established the specific geographic PRA area they are mandated to protect, and defined the legal or scientific justification for committing resources to the investigation.
They have their target.
With the parameters locked, we transition into Stage 2, pest risk assessment.
This is the crucible.
This is where the biological, meteorological, and economic modeling actually occurs. And Stage 2 is subdivided into 3 rigorous steps.
Step 1 operates as a highly efficient triage mechanism known as pest categorization.
Triage. I like that. Before an NPPO unleashes its most expensive stochastic models and climatic simulations, they run the target organism through a definitive biological filter.
They have to ask one binary question. Does this organism meet the strict international definition of a quarantine pest?
And that definition is an incredibly rigid legal threshold. To be classified as a quarantine pest under ISPM standards, the organism must possess the biological potential to cause significant economic impact to the specific area under threat.
But equally critical are the geographic and regulatory prerequisites.
Right.
The pest must either be entirely absent from the PRA area, or, if it is already present, its distribution must be highly restricted, and it must be subject to intense official control measures.
I really want to push back on that officially controlled caveat for a second because it seems like a massive point of geopolitical friction.
It absolutely is.
If an invasive nematode is already present in a country's domestic soil, the default WTO stance is that the country cannot ban imports that might carry that exact same nematode, right?
Correct. You can't penalize a trading partner for a biological reality you already live with.
But the exception is official control. If a government is actively spending millions of dollars to quarantine that nematode to a single domestic county, utilizing chemical eradication and domestic movement bans,
then they maintain the legal right to block foreign imports carrying it.
The categorization phase hinges entirely on proving that domestic eradication effort is genuine and not just a paper tiger designed to maintain import bans.
That is a highly astute observation, and it is exactly why the categorization phase is so critical. It prevents the weaponization of omnipresent, low-impact pests as trade barriers.
It's the bouncer at the door checking IDs.
Yes, categorization is effectively a rapid, qualitative assessment. It looks at the baseline taxonomy, the established geographic distribution, and the historical regulatory status of the pest.
And if it fails?
If the organism fails to meet any of the strict criteria of a quarantine pest, perhaps it's already widely distributed across the importing country with no official control program in place, the triage process immediately halts the analysis.
The bouncer says, go ahead, you're fine.
The organism is categorized as a non-threat in the context of international trade, and the pathway remains open. It is a vital mechanism to prevent the scientific apparatus from bogging down in endless assessments of ubiquitous, low-risk organisms.
But if the pest clears that hurdle, it moves into the deep analytical modeling of Step 2.
And step 2 of the assessment is where the sheer computational density of modern biosecurity comes into play. Formally, this is the assessment of the probability of entry, establishment, and spread.
This is the process of mapping a hypothetical biological invasion across a massive spatial and temporal scale. Let's break down the probability of entry first.
Okay.
An NPPO isn't just looking at the bug itself. They are modeling every single variable along the logistical chain.
Assessing entry requires a granular deconstruction of the entire commodity pathway. The risk modelers begin at the point of origin. What is the prevalence of the pest in the exporting country's fields? What is the statistical probability of the pest surviving the initial harvesting and packing house procedures?
Do they wash it?
Right. Is the commodity subjected to cold washing, fungicidal dips, or fumigation before export? Then they model the transit conditions.
This part is wild to me.
If the pest is secured inside a shipping container destined for a 20-day maritime voyage, the model must account for the ambient temperature fluctuations, the humidity levels inside the hold, and the physiological resilience of the pest during transit.
So they're calculating if this bug can literally survive a 20-day cruise in the dark.
Exactly. The assessment must yield a quantifiable probability that a viable, reproductively capable biological unit will successfully arrive at the destination port.
And furthermore, if the PRA was initiated based on a specific pest threat, the MPPO cannot just analyze the most obvious route.
No, they are required to map and evaluate all probable pathways that organism could exploit to cross the border.
But entry is only the first failure point. Even if a pathogen survives the transoceanic voyage and clears customs, it hasn't successfully invaded yet. It just exists in a state of suspended animation on a loading dock somewhere.
It's arrived, but it hasn't established.
Which brings us to the assessment of establishment. And this requires an incredibly deep dive into ecological niche modeling. To determine if a pathogen or an insect can transition from a transient arrival to a self-sustaining population, the modelers have to align the biological imperatives of the pest with the abiotic and biotic realities of the new environment.
Establishment modeling is arguably the most complex scientific endeavor within a PRA. The scientists must construct a comprehensive biological profile of the pest. What are its precise host plant requirements? Does it require a specific genus of tree to oviposit its eggs? What is its reproductive strategy?
But the biological profile is meaningless without a rigorous analysis of the abiotic environment, the non-living physical parameters of the target PRA area.
The weather, the soil.
Exactly. This is where we see the deployment of advanced computational frameworks like Climex or Maxent models. The analysts are mapping the temperature thresholds of the pest against the localized climatic data of the importing country.
They calculate degree day accumulations.
Right, to see if the local climate provides enough thermal energy for the insect to complete its life cycle before winter hits. They analyze precipitation patterns and intricate soil taxonomy.
Because if you have a soil-borne nematode that requires highly porous sandy loam to achieve mobility, and the target agricultural zone consists entirely of dense clay,
the probability of establishment drops significantly. It can't move. The source material emphasizes a crucial kind of counterintuitive point here. It is equally, if not more, important to identify the exact environmental parameters under which the pest experiences complete mortality.
you have to map the organism's physiological limits.
So the supercomputers are simulating 1,000 iterations of a fungal spore trying to survive the humidity of a Florida summer, or a wood-boring beetle attempting to overwinter in Minnesota.
Over and over again.
But let's assume the models indicate a high probability of establishment. The organism finds its host, survives the climate, and breeds. The final parameter of step 2 is assessing the probability and magnitude of spread. How does the established population disperse from that initial point of incursion?
Spread modeling requires dissecting the population dynamics and the inherent dispersal mechanics of the organism. You have to categorize its natural mobility. What is the flight capacity of the adult insect? Can the fungal spores be entrained in upper atmospheric wind currents and carried across state lines?
Is the pathogen heavily reliant on complex water systems or soil gradients for localized movement?
But natural dispersal is usually relatively slow.
Right, bugs only fly so fast. The factor that exponentially accelerates spread, and the factor that models really struggle to predict accurately, is human-assisted movement.
We move things way faster than nature does.
The source explicitly mandates the assessment of spread via human activities. If an infected ornamental plant is unknowingly purchased at a commercial nursery and driven halfway across the country in the back of a civilian's car, That pest just bypassed every natural geographic barrier and climatic limitation in a matter of hours.
It's instant teleportation for the pest.
Furthermore, we have to consider complex vector relationships. It's rarely just the pathogen moving alone. It's the viral pathogen utilizing an indigenous aphid population as an entirely new vector.
The human-assisted pathways and the vector interactions are what transform a localized outbreak into a continental crisis.
In all of these highly quantified probabilities, entry, establishment, and spread, they funnel directly into the culmination of the assessment phase. Step 3. The assessment of potential consequences.
The fallout.
If this biological agent successfully navigates the entire invasion sequence, what is the ultimate cost to the PRA area?
The consequence assessment demands a multidisciplinary approach to quantify that fallout. The immediate metric is economic impact. What is the projected loss in gross agricultural yield? What are the projected costs of deploying mass chemical eradication protocols or implementing rolling agricultural quarantines?
But the analysis must extend far beyond just the balance sheets of commercial farming. They have to assess profound environmental impacts, the potential reduction of native biodiversity, the destabilization of keystone species, and the cascading effects on local ecosystems.
And perhaps the most complex and devastating metric highlighted in the source material is the potential for catastrophic social impacts.
Yeah, this part of the reading was intense.
The socioeconomic consequences of a severe plant pest invasion cannot be overstated. The source bibliography specifically references the devastating progression of Xanthomonas wilt of banana.
Commonly known as BXW.
Right, BXW, across East and Central Africa. This is an aggressive bacterial disease that causes complete systemic wilting and yield loss in banana cultivars.
And in those regions, the banana isn't just a cash crop or a snack.
No, it is the foundational staple of the daily diet. It is a primary source of localized income for millions of smallholder farmers. The destruction of that crop transcends economic loss. It triggers acute regional food insecurity.
It forces mass displacement.
It deepens poverty cycles and directly destabilizes the social fabric of entire nations. When a PRA evaluates a threat of that magnitude, the consequence metrics are fundamentally assessing the preservation of human life and social order.
To predict those consequences, risk assessors logically rely on historical data. They analyze the empirical damage the pest has inflicted in its native range, and more importantly, the documented damage it has caused in areas it has previously invaded.
But this reliance on historical precedent exposes a massive ecological trap.
Yes, expert speaker. The source material highlights a critical vulnerability in how we forecast environmental impacts, specifically when dealing with naive ecosystems.
If we connect this to the broader principles of invasion ecology, we hit what is arguably the most dangerous assumption in phytosanitary modeling.
Which is?
The source explicitly warns against assuming that a pest's behavior in its native range dictates its potential behavior in a novel environment. In its endemic region, a pathogen or an insect has co-evolved over millennia with its host plants, its natural predators, and its competitors. It exists within a constrained ecological equilibrium. Its impact is buffered.
It's kept in check. But the moment you introduce that organism into a completely naive ecosystem, a completely new continent, where the native flora possess absolutely zero co-evolved genetic resistance, and where there are no natural predators to suppress the pest's population growth,
It explodes.
that previously harmless organism can exhibit explosive, unprecedented virulence.
Precisely. This phenomenon renders predictive modeling incredibly difficult. The text makes an unequivocal statement. The lack of significant environmental impact in an organism's area of origin is absolutely not a reliable predictor that there will be negligible impacts in regions where the pest is newly introduced.
It's a false sense of security.
An organism that is a minor asymptomatic nuisance in its native habitat can become an apex ecological destroyer in a new biome.
So by the conclusion of Stage 2, the risk assessors must synthesize all of this, the complex probabilities of the invasion sequence, and the potentially catastrophic, highly unpredictable consequences to generate an overall estimation of pest risk.
And if that final calculation indicates that the pest presents a risk level deemed unacceptable by the importing nation, the PRA transitions into its final phase, Stage 3.
Stage 3, pest risk management. The scientific assessment is locked. Now the NPPO must pivot to regulatory action.
Time to make the rules.
Their mandate is to select and implement specific phytosanitary measures capable of mitigating the identified risk down to a mathematically acceptable threshold. They have to design and deploy the shield.
But the deployment of that shield is strictly governed by the overarching international agreements we discussed earlier.
The WTO is watching.
The NPPO cannot simply enact a blanket embargo and shut down the port. The phytosanitary measures they select must strictly adhere to core IPPC principles. The foremost of these is the principle of necessity.
Meaning every regulatory action must be demonstrably required to protect plant health, not domestic profit margins.
They must adhere to the principle of managed risk, which acknowledges that in a paradigm of international trade, absolute zero risk is an impossibility. The goal is an acceptable level of risk.
And I think the most contentious principle in the management phase is the principle of minimal impact.
Then that one causes a lot of headaches.
It dictates that a nation must select the phytosanitary measure that constitutes the least restrictive barrier to international trade, provided it achieves the necessary risk reduction. This is where the tension between capitalism and biosecurity reaches its absolute peak.
Give an example.
Okay, if a risk model shows that requiring a foreign exporter to subject their fruit to a specialized vapor heat treatment reduces the probability of pest survival to 0.01%.
Just a tiny fraction of a percent.
The importing nation is legally barred from implementing a total ban on the fruit. They must accept the treated fruit, even if there is a lingering microscopic margin of error. The mandate for minimal impact forces nations to accept a razor-thin biological vulnerability just to keep global markets fluid.
It is a profound compromise, and the management decisions are further constrained by principles of transparency, harmonization with existing international standards, and non-discrimination.
Non-discrimination is big.
You cannot apply a draconian fumigation requirement to imports from country A while allowing the exact same commodity from country B to enter with minimal screening, assuming the underlying biological risk profile is identical. The application of risk management must be universally consistent.
But the application of risk management brings us to the most opaque and honestly intellectually challenging aspect of this entire process.
Yeah.
The concept of uncertainty.
The fog of war.
Because despite the veneer of absolute mathematical precision, despite the climax models, the thermal mortality curves, and the trade law precedents, pest risk analysis is fundamentally an exercise in extrapolation.
It's predicting the future.
The source text formally acknowledges that estimating the likelihood of a biological introduction and its cascading consequences involves profound inherent uncertainties.
Uncertainty is not an error in the model. It is an inescapable feature of predicting biological behavior in novel environments. ISPM 11 formally demands the recognition of uncertainty because risk assessors are routinely tasked with utilizing historical, geographically constrained data to forecast a purely hypothetical interaction in an ecosystem the pest has never encountered.
Sometimes the data just isn't there.
In many PRAs, the specific empirical data required to confidently run the simulation simply does not exist. There may be 0 peer-reviewed studies analyzing how a specific fungal pathogen responds to the microclimates of a target agricultural zone because the pathogen has never breached that zone.
So when the empirical data runs dry, how does the MPPO complete the risk matrix? The source indicates they must rely heavily on expert judgment.
Yes, expert judgment.
Let's be critical for a moment. Isn't expert judgment just a polite regulatory loophole for highly educated guesswork? I mean, if a sovereign nation is blocking a billion-dollar trade route and their technical justification relies on expert judgment, isn't that a massive vulnerability in international trade court?
It sounds like a vulnerability, but within the PRA framework, expert judgment isn't arbitrary guessing. It's managed through structured elicitation and probabilistic bounding.
Still sounds pretty subjective.
It is highly subjective, which is exactly why the mandatory documentation of that uncertainty is so vital, highlighting exactly where the data is robust and exactly where the analysis relies on extrapolated expert judgment is a strict requirement for international transparency.
You have to show your work.
It allows trading partners to see the exact structural integrity of the mathematical argument. Furthermore, documenting that uncertainty serves a critical strategic purpose. It functions as a roadmap for future scientific inquiry.
How so?
If a massive trade negotiation is stalled entirely because we lack empirical data regarding the dispersal velocity of a specific nematode, that documented uncertainty immediately prioritizes global agricultural research funding to go solve that specific data deficit.
Oh, that makes sense. We need to know this to sell our apples, so let's fund a study.
Exactly.
Okay, we have systematically disassembled the entire apparatus here. We've examined the geopolitical tug-of-war between the WTO and the IPPC. We've mapped the initiation triggers, the deep ecological modeling of entry, establishment, and spread, and the complex trade-offs of risk management and uncertainty.
We've covered a lot.
So what does this all mean for the security of our global ecosystems? How robust is this invisible shield? To answer that, we have to confront the blind spots.
The cracks in the armor.
The final section of our source material delves into the profound structural criticisms of pest risk analysis. And frankly, some of these flaws present a terrifying existential crisis for global biosecurity.
They really do.
The most glaring foundational flaw, the entire system, is inherently, inescapably reactive.
This is the operational paradox of the current framework. The massive regulatory machinery we just detailed, the NPPOs, the ISPMs, the stochastic models, it almost exclusively activates after a pest problem has been definitively identified and cataloged.
It's a defense architecture that requires the enemy to strike first.
The source material emphasizes a sobering reality. Many of the most destructive invasive pests currently subject to extreme, multi-million-dollar phytosanitary measures only became recognized as international risks after they had successfully breached their endemic borders and inflicted catastrophic ecological damage in secondary environments.
We're essentially building the fortress walls using the rubble of the first destroyed city.
That's a grim way to put it, but accurate.
And this reliance on historical precedent creates an immense vulnerability regarding what the text calls the unknown threat.
The ghosts.
The ghosts. Our mathematical models require data inputs. They require taxonomies, thermal limits, and host ranges. But what happens when the organism attempting to cross the border is a ghost?
We don't know it exists.
The source explicitly points out that many newly escaped organisms currently ravaging ecosystems were completely unknown to science prior to their initial invasion. They weren't in any database. They weren't categorized. The text states unequivocally that current international standards for pest risk analysis are structurally incapable of assessing risks from unknown organisms.
Which presents a profound epistemological crisis for biosecurity. How do you assess the entry, establishment, and spread vectors of a biological agent that your scientific paradigm does not yet recognize?
You can't.
You cannot. The model relies on known variables. It cannot compute absolute unknowns. And even when we pivot to the organisms we do have extensive data on, we encounter a massive biological blind spot.
The evolutionary dynamic. The text raises a heavy criticism regarding how PRA models treat genetics. A standard PRA typically evaluates a pest at the species level, operating under the baseline assumption that the organism is genetically stable.
And this is where the static mathematical model completely fails to capture the dynamic reality of biology. The assumption that a beetle or a fungal spore is a fixed, unchanging entity is a massive oversimplification.
It's just not true.
The source warns that treating an organism as genetically static is highly dangerous, particularly when dealing with pests that possess very short generation times and a high capacity for rapid genetic recombination or adaptation.
We are talking about highly mutable RNA viruses, adaptable fungal pathogens, and rapidly reproducing insect vectors.
The models are static snapshots of a moving target.
Give me a scenario.
An NPPO might conduct a brilliant, exhaustively researched PRA, concluding that a specific fungal pathogen is incapable of surviving the winter temperatures of a target region, based entirely on a century of historical data from the pathogen's native range.
Sounds solid.
But once that fungus is introduced into the new environment, the selective pressures are entirely different. If the organism undergoes a rapid evolutionary shift, perhaps hybridizing with a local benign fungal strain, or undergoing a spontaneous mutation that lowers its thermal threshold by 3 degrees, it suddenly bypasses the exact climatic barrier the PRA relied upon. Or what if it rapidly adapts to exploit an entirely new, closely related host plant that wasn't included in the original risk matrix? The biological reality outpaces the regulatory model, and the original assessment of potential impact becomes catastrophically underestimated.
We are deploying fixed algorithms to fight an evolving, adaptive adversary. And compounding the biological evolution is the final layer of systemic criticism, human error, and institutional bias.
These models aren't perfect.
These risk models are not generated in a vacuum. They are produced by human scientists operating within highly pressurized political and economic structures. The source notes that PRAs are frequently criticized by ecologists for being dangerously narrow in their focus.
Assessing only the direct agricultural impacts, while ignoring complex, indirect trophic cascades that could devastate a forest ecosystem.
Furthermore, they are accused of being highly subjective, arbitrary in their reliance on expert judgment when data is scarce, and inevitably vulnerable to political interference.
Returning to the overarching conflict between international trade and biosecurity, the financial leverage at play is staggering.
Billions of dollars.
A scientific conclusion that a pest represents an unacceptable risk can instantly sever a multi-billion-dollar agricultural supply chain. The NPPO scientists drafting that conclusion will face immense sustained political lobbying and aggressive legal challenges from powerful exporting nations, multinational agricultural corporations, and domestic trade organizations demanding the borders remain open.
The PRA is designed to be an impartial scientific document, but it exists and is litigated within a hyper-politicized, profit-driven global arena.
It's a lot of pressure on those scientists.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at a single suitcase on a baggage carousel and scaled up to dissect the massive, interlocking machinery of global biosecurity.
It's a huge system.
We mapped the tension between the World Trade Organization's mandate for open markets and the International Plant Protection Convention's mandate for ecological defense. We explored the deeply complex three-stage architecture of pest risk analysis.
From the initial triggers of a novel pathogen appearing in scientific literature,
Through the exhaustive ecological niche modeling of entry, establishment, and spread.
all the way to the legally fraught application of risk management and documented uncertainty.
And we ended by staring directly into the profound blind spots of a system that relies on static historical data to battle a dynamic, evolving biological world.
The key takeaway is recognizing your own position within this vast mathematically quantified matrix. The next time you cross an international border or purchase imported agriculture or observe the movement of global shipping, understand the sheer scale of the scientific apparatus calculating the probabilistic risk of every interaction.
It's all around us.
The regulations governing what biological material can cross a border are not arbitrary bureaucratic hurdles. They are the visible manifestations of incredibly dense ecological modeling designed to prevent the collapse of our agricultural infrastructure and native biodiversity. You are an active participant in a continuous global biosecurity equation.
The shield is invisible, it's highly flawed, but it is the only defense we have. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought regarding the reactive nature of this entire system.
Okay.
If our absolute best line of global defense is a mathematical model that requires historical data to fight a known biological threat, how do we even begin the philosophical and scientific pivot required to design a biosecurity framework capable of intercepting a catastrophic organism that hasn't even evolved yet?
It is the defining ecological puzzle of the modern, hyper-connected era. We are utilizing the data of the past in a desperate attempt to build walls against the unpredictable biology of the future.
And that is exactly where we have to leave it for today. Keep analyzing the systems around you, keep questioning the models, and seriously check the bottom of your hiking boots the next time you clear customs.